Hi, so this is the fifth lecture for the Psychological Foundations of Music Behavior class for Module 5. And today we're going to be talking about music in the brain, or neuroscience and music. So when we talk about cognitive neuroscience of music, there's one kind of primary question that we're addressing, that we're really trying to look at as we explore this topic. And that question is, are there neural networks that are dedicated to the process of music that are unresponsive or inadequate for dealing with non-musical input? So essentially, you have to forgive, my dog is eating, so if you're hearing weird noises on the side, that's what that is. So the question is, when the brain processes music, are there specific structures within the brain that only are dedicated to music, or are those resources shared with other tasks? This is a pretty big question. It's a question that we haven't really asked for very long. Probably in the past 30 years is really when the research on this has happened. And that's mainly because of technology. Before that, it was very hard to look at the inner workings of the brain. And as you read in the readings, the parts of the brain that are involved in musical tasks are kind of hard to find, or in some of the less accessible places of the brain. So we're really trying to see if music has its own, neural resources, or if it's shared. And the reason why this question is important is because if the brain has resources, or parts of the brain are dedicated just to music, it suggests that music is a biologically based human behavior, and that it is a response to evolution. It's an evolutionary adaptation of some sort. But if the answer is no, if there isn't dedicated resources or neural networks for music, then it suggests that it's shared with other resources, such as language resources or auditory and speech resources, and that suggests that musical behavior is really only a cultural artifact that arose from language learning or hearing learning, those sorts of things, and that it's just a happy accident that we have music. It doesn't really serve an evolutionary purpose for any reason. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain, and I'm going to have some links to some diagrams, but I'll probably just use my hand as a little bit of a guide. So when we're talking about the brain, most of the things that we talk about when dealing with music processing, we're talking about the neocortex. So if you think of the brain, it normally sits on this little thing on the back, which is the cerebellum, which that is kind of, when you hear people talk about the lizard brain, that's what they're talking about. That's the undeveloped brain that has a fight or flight response. It has some very basic emotional responses, but it's definitely not involved in kind of cognitive thinking as much. But everything that we're going to talk about is part of the neocortex, which is the newer portion of the cerebral cortex that serves as the center of higher mental functions for humans. Okay, and so just a couple of things to talk about the different lobes of the brain. So there are four primary lobes. You have the frontal lobe. So you have to think the face of the human is here. And like I said, the cerebellum is kind of here. So the frontal lobe is right in front. Makes sense. It's located in front of the central sulcus, and it's primarily concerned with reasoning, planning. It is involved in speech and movement. And the back of the frontal cortex, just for my purposes here, this would be the motor cortex here, the primary motor cortex, and then there's the secondary motor cortex right there. So the frontal lobe is at the front of the brain. Then the parietal lobe sits right behind it, and it's located behind the central sulcus, and it's concerned with the perception of stimuli such as touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. So it's your primary sensory input area of the brain. And then the temporal lobe, which is kind of on the underside, kind of think of on the sides of the brain. It's located below the lateral fissure, and my notes just went away. Here we go. On the lateral fissure, and it's concerned with perception and recognition of auditory stimuli, in hearing, and memory, as it also houses the hippocampus. So, and it makes sense that this part of the brain deals with auditory things because it's connected right to the ears. So it's right. This is the temporal part of your skull, and all these lobes are. They're named that because part of the skull next to it are these same names. And then finally, the occipital lobe, which is located at the back of the brain. It's behind the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, and its main functions deal with vision. And so, like I said, so the back of the frontal lobe, you have the primary cortex, and then you have the motor association cortex, so the motor cortex, there really are parts of that cortex that deal with every part of your body. So if, there's a part that is connected to your foot, and so all the nerves that deal with coordinating the foot, they go to that area of the motor cortex. The other parts of the brain that you need to understand is that in the temporal areas, you've got Wernicke's area, and you've also got Broca's area, and those are both dealt with speech. And so I'll put a thing on a link so that you can see a diagram of this, because I know this is not terribly helpful. But yeah, so on both sides of the brain, you have these speech areas that are located within the temporal lobe. So when thinking about the brain and music processing, you've probably heard this forever, and I still hear this all the time talking about, there's right-brained and left-brained people, and music are right-brained, it's a right function, it's artistic, and language is left function. And the more people do research on various tasks, they're finding that there really isn't left brain and right brain. That's really kind of a myth. So they have looked at, is there any lateralization? Is there one side or the other that music processing happens more on? As I said, there is processing going on both sides, but there have been some studies that have shown some differences in where certain processes happen. For instance, fine-grained pitch processing may be right lateralized, but most other functions are bilateral or even left lateralized. Shh, quiet. And as researchers are doing more about looking at the inner workings of the brain and music processing, they're finding that it's more about the networks, how things are connected to each other, more so than if they're on the left side or the right side. In the text, it talks about neuroplasticity, which that's the ability for the neural networks to change in the cortical maps due to experiences. And you've probably heard, commercials for luminosity, and there's a new thing I heard for like a curiosity quotient or whatever that are supposed to help with neuroplasticity, so that they are suggesting that it will help fend off things like dementia and Alzheimer's, even though there's not really any evidence that those things will do that. But it's just this idea that certain experiences can change the networks, and looking at music processing or musicians and how their brain works, we can really look at neuroplasticity, just because you can compare musicians that have had extended, because most musicians who least have a college degree in music, have spent hours and hours and hours and hours doing a specific technical skill that requires motor coordination, that requires, reaction to auditory stimuli and reaction to visual stimuli. So you can take those people and compare them to people that haven't been trained to see if there are any differences. And in the text, it talked about how, when looking at the motor cortex of violin players who have, part of their motor cortex that deals with the left hand, more space in the brain was dedicated to that kind of coordination because it's much more refined and precise compared to the right hand of piano players, because they similarly have that precision. So compare those to control groups, they have much more space dedicated to that. So that was just an example of neuroplasticity and how we can look at it. So within cognitive neuroscience of music, there are really two primary methodologies for looking at this question of how the brain processes music. Neuropsychology and neuroimagery. And in neuropsychology, the goal is to examine the connection between brain disorders, whether acquired or congenital, and loss of function. It is also the only way of determining whether a particular brain region is necessary for a particular function. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about neuropsychology in a few minutes. But we're going to spend more, right now we're going to talk about neuroimaging, which is what, especially right now, a lot of research in this is looking at, because we finally have the technology to do this. So neuroimaging, there's really two main methods for looking at music processing within the brain through neuroimaging. And the first is structural. And the questions that's asked through structural neuroimaging is, are there morphological differences in the brains of people with different abilities? Are there different structures? Are there different networks that are being utilized between people that have different abilities? The other way is through functional neuroimaging, which the goal there is to identify which area of the brains participate in a certain cognitive task and the strength of that participation. So in functional studies, they're normally having the people in the scanner do something while they're being scanned. And so that brings us to the type of scanner they go into. Oh, actually, I'm going to talk about structural imaging first. It's a little out of order, but you'll get it. So with structural imaging, they've done a lot of, they have looked at musicians' brains and non-musicians' brains, and they have found that there are some structural differences in musicians' brains. Musicians have structural differences in primary brain regions associated with auditory and motor learning. So not only what I was just talking about with the violin and piano, where there's more space dedicated to fine motor learning or fine motor coordination, but auditory areas are more activated with, or they're larger resources used for auditory listening. That's a redundant, but for auditory functions in musicians. The corpus callosum, which is, so if you have the two hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum is this bridge between the two, and they found that musicians had larger corpus callosums than non-musicians, which could indicate how important the cross, all the activity in the different sides of the brain are because of that. Although I believe men typically have thicker corpus callosums than women, and so they found that that gender, like there's kind of there's an interaction where, yeah. So in some ways, it kind of the gender difference isn't as as pronounced between men and women in the corpus callosum. Absolute pitch subjects showed a greater left lateralization in the temporal lobe than non-absolute pitch musicians in control. So they found that people that had perfect pitch, there was more activation going on within the left temporal lobe. So that could suggest that something about their brains is different, and that's what causes them to have this ability to have perfect pitch. Okay, and so going back to functional neuroimaging, so structural, that was really looking at the structures of their brain. Those people were, when they looked at their brain, they were either, they're a musician, let's look at their brain. They're a musician with perfect pitch, let's look at their brain. They're a non-musician, let's look at their brain. Now we're going to talk about people that were in the scanner and they were probably doing some sort of function so that they could look at changes in their brain. And so functional neuroimaging is, the goal is to study changes in brain activity while subjects perform certain cognitive tasks. So imaging studies, they can either use both abnormal populations, so people that have a certain deficit of some sort, or normal populations to study an activity while they perform their tasks. And they normally do this through two different ways. They either measure electrical activity, which how this happens is that the brain gives off an electrical energy that can be measured and related to certain activities or the presence absence of certain stimuli. If you think about, remember last week when we were talking about, I think it was last week, it maybe even been the week before, where babies would listen to music from their culture, other cultures, and like they would be listening to music that had 2/4 or 4/4 music, but then they would have some, like put in a 7/8, and so when there's something that they're not expected, their brain has an electrical, the brain says like, what's going on, and it has an electrical charge. Same way, we can also use that. We can also measure changes in cerebral blood flow while a task is being performed compared to rest or to other tasks. So both of those kind of deal with how you're going to measure. Are you looking at the electrical activity, or are you looking at the blood flow? And so there are a couple of different, and you read about these in the text, there are a couple of different devices or tools that are used to look at functional imaging, neuroimaging. And the first is electroencephalography, and this is measuring the electrical activity of the brain via surface electrodes. So they put electrodes on the brain. If you've ever seen pictures of someone wearing this kind of helmet with all these like wires coming out, that's an EEG. And again, and the thing is it's not very precise because one, if they're not shaved, if they have hair on their head, then the electrodes are hard to attach to the brain to get a really precise. But that's kind of that's an older form of neuroimaging. The positron emission tomography, or the PET, that's an imaging test that uses a radioactive substance called a tracer to look at the blood flow in the brain. And so this is more precise as far as finding the location of things than the EEG. The MRI, which I'm sure you've heard just as far as in kind of common lexicon, stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and so it uses a large magnet and radio waves to look at the structure of the brain, which this gives you a really, really precise picture of what the brain is. the thing that needs to be clear is that on an MRI, it's looking at just the structure. It's not looking at changes within the structure. For that, you have to get a functional MRI or fMRI. And it uses the same magnet, but it detects blood flow changes within the brain. And so it's kind of confusing. MRI is just looking at the structure of something, and fMRI is looking at the changes within the brain. Going back, just kind of another little vocabulary word, the event-related potential, or ERP, that's the electrical activity of the brain that occurs immediately after a certain event. And so when you're talking about EEGs, they're looking for the ERPs when there is this event, and to see where in the brain there's activity, this electrical charge that is activated when there's this stimulus or some event occurring. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of studies, and you read that review that kind of went over a lot. It was a review of studies looking at various parts of the brain and how what parts of the brain are connected to certain musical processes or behaviors. And I'm not going to go into real deep detail for that. One, this is just an introductory course into all of this, and so I'm going to talk about a couple of these things, and then kind of hopefully wrap up some ideas about the research. Again, this research is really, really young. Almost all those studies in that review are within the last 20 years, and so with every study, each study itself is one case, and so we're slowly building an understanding of what's going on. So anyway, when looking at brain imaging, Zatorre found that fine-grained representation of pitch involves the right auditory cortex, especially Heschl's gyrus, which in the text it talks about Heschl's gyrus. Pitch pattern perception involves the right superior temporal gyrus and interaction with the right frontal area, possibly related to tonal working memory. So it really looks like the right side is dealing with some of these pitch perception ideas, or the idea of tonality could be involved in that. Now, some studies looked at people that had problems. Either they had part of their brain removed, or they had lesions. So they scanned them, and they kind of found some differences between what these different participants could do. For instance, people that had the part of their right temporal cortex impaired, or if part of their right temporal lobe had been removed, it impaired their contour and interval recognition. However, if they had their left cortex impaired, or part of it removed, then it only affected the interval recognition. Those that had their posterior temporal gyrus excised, it interfered with pitch and temporal processing. However, if the anterior temporal gyrus was excised, only interfered with metrical processing. So again, don't get caught up in all the details, like each fact of that. For me, the thing that I take away is that it looks like that the temporal lobe is really important for not only pitch but also metrical processing. Sampson and Zatorre, this is in 1992, that they found that people that had problems, parts of the right temporal lobe or the left temporal lobe excised, that that it impaired both the learning and recognition of both melodies and nonsense syllables. But if they worked with them, that those that had affected left temporal lobes, they were able to improve on melodies, while people with the right temporal lobe excis had were able to improve on their nonsense syllables. So again, it kind of shows a dissociation between language and musical processing. Subjects with incisions in either the left superior temporal gyrus or right superior temporal gyrus with differing extension into Heschel's gyrus. When they asked them questions on giving them same or different tasks, there was no impairment. But if they asked them if melodies were either higher or lower, those that had problems on the right superior temporal gyrus, they couldn't tell if things were higher and lower unless there was a much larger interval gap. So again, there's on the right side, again, there's some more issues with pitch processing. So when looking at how music performance could have affected the structures or how the brain utilizes its resources, they found that musicians, by either playing or even just hearing and even just imagining pieces, subjects have already learned, even beginners, it would activate the audio motor cortex network. So it would activate. So just, if you ask them to think through a song, and if they, hear it in their head, it activates the audio portions in their head, and it also activates the motor cortex that deals with that production. So if they were a pianist, it would activate the part of the motor cortex that deals with their hands. So it's pretty interesting. When they have done some scanning, some imaging tests, studies that looked at sight reading, they found that sight reading tasks are dissociated from text reading and that different resources are being used. However, a caveat, the complexity of the task, sight reading is a super, super complex task. So it makes it really difficult to study and really hard to isolate what is really going on there. When looking at studies that compare musicians versus non-musicians, they found that the training, that instrumental training shapes motor areas and finger representations. We mentioned that before. But we also found that cortical reorganization, how much space is used, is influenced by age at onset. So when did they start learning to do this? So, if you pick up the violin at age 20, you're not going to be able to have those same resources in your brain used for the fine motor coordination that someone that is 6 if they start playing. Okay, so thinking about music and language, and the text talks about this a good bit. So some early work looked at, by using PET scans, they looked at attention to pitch qualities of language, prosody, that's kind of the sing-songy nature of speaking. For instance, an example of prosody is, when you ask a question, the pitch goes up. Are you feeling okay? Like that's the pitch contours that happen in speaking. So some of the early studies looking at pitch, they found that that pitch qualities of language activate frontal regions and are right lateralized. Some fMRI studies looking at pitch, they looked at bilingual tonal language speakers who process lexical pitch, and so that's, I think, Cantonese, I believe, is a lexical pitch. So they found that when they were bilingual, when they speak one language that has lexical pitch and one that doesn't, they found that they process the lexical pitch in the left insular cortex, kind of in the inside of the brain, and non-lexical pitch on the right insular cortex. So we're now going to talk about neuropsychology, which to remind you that the goal of neuropsychology is to examine the connection between brain disorders, whether those are acquired or congenital meaning from birth or naturally, and loss of function. And it's also the only way of determining whether a particular brain region is necessary for a particular function. So in neuropsychology, there are different approaches or techniques to examining these ideas, and these techniques normally depend on identifying and studying subjects with different pathologies of brain trauma. And so they are either symptom-led, such as the studies that we looked at that dealt with people with amusia. They have symptoms. They either can't process music or they can't produce music. So that's one type of subjects that they look at, and the other are those that have lesions within their brain. And so what happens there is that they have a lesion, either that caused by a stroke or some other brain trauma, and then they look at how that lesion affects their cognitive functions. And that's where, if they find that, this person used to be able to dribble a basketball and roller skate, but after they had a stroke, they can only roller skate, but they can't dribble a basketball, then you would say that those are dissociated. They're using different structures of the brain. Whatever caused them not be able to dribble a basketball does not, that has been affected, but the roller skating, those are different resources, and so those aren't affected. Whereas if there's another patient who had a stroke, and they used to be able to do both of those things, but they now cannot. Roxy, shh. They can't. They can no longer roller skate, but they can still basketball. Then that's an example of double dissociation, where it seems that these things are completely removed from each other. And so, so through neuropsychology, we're looking for dissociation between different types of cognitive function. Selective loss, selective sparing. And dissociation is the primary evidence for specialization. So within neuropsychology, we have found that music processing has been found to be double dissociated in some cases from other forms of auditory processes, such as speech or environmental sounds. So that means that when people had, brain trauma, they either lost music processing but didn't lose speech processing, or the other way around, they lost speech processing but didn't lose music processing. So that's why it's considered doubly dissociated. This is both true for acquired and congenital cases of amusia. And we're going to keep going. In neuropsychology, we are interested in two types of, there are two kinds of cases that we are particularly interested in, and one is auditory agnosia, and that's the inability to recognize sounds, words, or music. And then a smaller subset of people with that auditory agnosia are people with amusia, which is auditory agnosia specific to musical information. And the clinical definition there is the inability to perceive music, which is considered the receptive form of amusia, or produce music, which is considered the productive form of amusia. And so congenital amusia, we believe, is something that is a state that people have. And again, it's hard, the whole, is it genetic or is it environmental? It's really hard to untangle those variables, because most of the time people with similar genetics have very similar environments. So, but for congenital amusia, we normally consider that people that their whole life they have had this condition, and the way that we identify amusia now is we ask subjects to take the Montreal Battery for the evaluation of amusia. And what that is it's a standardized test where they have people listen to musical examples and they give them two examples, and they just ask, is it the same or different? And they have several different types of tasks. For instance, there'll be things that are examples will use, one example will use one scale, one will use a different scale. And so it's to see if they can hear the differences in scales. One will be if there are differences in contours. Can they hear the same contour but different pitch classes, different rhythmic values, all sorts of things like that. But the whole process is always in, are these two things the same or are they different? So congenital amusia, it affects approximately 4% of the general population. And the way, like you said, you take this now to examine or to see if people have this condition. If they score 2 standard deviations below the mean, then they are considered, amusic and amusic. The thing is right now we don't know a whole lot about. We know more about it than we did in 20 years ago, but it may be associated with differences in brain structure. There is some evidence for that, but it's just now emerging. But it also may be associated with genetics, as you read. So let's talk about the 2 studies that you read for this module. On the first, the Cuddy et al., the 2005 study. So they looked at 200 university students. 100 of them were self-described tone deaf, and the other 100 matched were deemed, or they did not self-identify as tone deaf. And they all took the MBEA, and they filled out a survey about their musical experiences and their listening habits and such like that. And so while in the general population, if you just ask people if they're tone deaf or not, 17% of population will say that they are tone deaf, which within the literature, we're really trying to iron out like who is really tone deaf and who has just think that they're tone deaf because someone told them that they're a bad singer. And so now there's a different, so we have people that are, so tone deaf is kind of, it's a passé word. We would really say that they're amusic, or, they have congenital amusia. And then we call people that may not be very precise at singing imprecise singers. So that could be a cultural thing that, people, if they aren't involved in music at all, they feel like they can't sing at all for some reason. And that's something as music educators we really need to fight. And we definitely should really consider, when talking to our kids about their singing ability, even if they aren't very good at matching pitch, to not say, oh, you shouldn't sing or you're a bad singer, because I think that's part of where we have this culture of people seeing themselves as non-singers. But anyway, so even though they had 100 people, 100 people self-identify in the study as tone deaf, only 11% of the subjects scored below the criterion. So that clearly shows that the perception of people thinking that they're tone deaf, they just really aren't. People with congenital amusia, they have a problem processing music. So that's one of the first findings that, from the study that we should really take to heart, that, when people say that they're tone deaf, they probably aren't. It's much more, only 4% of people have this condition. But they also found that singing difficulties and listening behaviors were significantly related to MBEA scores. So it suggests that, how musically active, both as a singer or as a listener, can affect their ability to process music. And if you go back to the study and if you look at, it's really wild to look at these graphs. So they show in that inset, the smaller box, they show from a previous study that kind of compares functioning people with a music. So you can see that there's clearly, you've got, the controls, they've got this bell curve over here, and then you've got more like this, kind of, it's almost a plateau for the amusics. But then when you look at Cuddy's study of just self-identified, it really looks very similar to the control group, which, with the exception of the very, very high performing, it's very similar. So, so it shows that people may not really know what deficits they have and they don't have. So then the other study we looked at, the Peretz et al., the 2007 study, it was basically asking this question of, is it genetic? Is a music genetic? And if so, would we see it in families? And I think this is a wild study just because I kind of, for my own personal belief, I thought, it probably is genetic. But when you look at this, the data, it's pretty intriguing. So they looked at 13 confirmed musics. They, had them take the MBEA battery just to make sure that, that they did indeed qualify as a music. And they had 17 match controls. And then they also contacted 71 family members of 9 of the musics and assessed either through self-report, which again, there's a little degree of validity issues there, but you have self-report and then internet-based testing. And so the thing that's really interesting to me is within the music group of the siblings of a music, so people that share DNA with them, 9 out of 21 siblings were also a music, and that's 43%. But then when you looked at the offspring of the musics, 2 of 21, so a little under 10%, were a music. So, So the thing that's interesting to me, I think it's kind of conflicting, and definitely there's a lot more work to be done on this. But definitely there seems to be, with so many, 43% of siblings were amusic. That seems pretty high. That's it's almost a 50-50 chance, which that kind of sounds like, like talking about genes, but then when you talk about the children, it seems such a smaller percentage. So that's it's interesting. But then when you look at the controls, of the 17 people that I looked at, the 22 siblings, there were only two, so about 10%, and then 0 of the offspring. And so then they had that diagram where they kind of show the family trees, and those that were black, those are your amusics. And I just think it's so wild. And so when you look at, so you're looking at each of these families, and the only one that had children was the first one. Oh, I lied. Needless to say, so like looking at this, there really, to me, it seems like in looking at the children, there's so few people that are amusics, and that's where the authors really say, well, maybe it's partly genetic. This seems to suggest that there is a relationship to some sort of genetic thing going on, but it could also be partly environmental, in that music is more ubiquitous now, and that kids are listening to music all the time. Music is much more portable. I mean, that's the thing, is when you think 50 years ago, music was just being in radios, and well, I mean, it's probably more like 80 years ago, but in the evolution of humans, it's a super small amount of time where music has been portable and personal, and people can listen to it all the time, and not either have to be actively making it or be in the same room as someone actively making it. So it could be that just the mere presence and listening to music, as it's become more integrated within all aspects of our culture, it seems that it's helped fight against people having this condition. So, but there's still a lot more work to be done, especially on looking at the perception versus the performance issues. Some people suggest that, especially with people that are imprecise singers, that it's not so much that they have problems processing the musical perception, the stimulus. It's more that they can't coordinate the audio motor coordination. They can't coordinate the vocal cords. They can't coordinate. They can't perceive that their sound is different than what they're hearing. That's where a lot of the work that's looking at poor pitch singing is looking at now. More work needs to be done to look at children, to see the development of looking at the musical behaviors of music people as they are in children, and then also to be looking at cross-culturally. Could this be a product of our culture, where we kind of have musicians and non-musicians, whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, or in Estonia and Latvia, where singing is or Bulgaria, where singing is embedded in lots of forms of culture, if these rates of deficits in music processing are there. And with that, we're going to end this discussion on neuropsychology and neuroimaging of the brain and neuroscience in music. All right, thanks.